And we're live. Welcome back to Comp and Coffee, everyone. Excited. This is my favorite episode of the year because we get to talk about CBPR. And if you're new to Comp and Coffee and you don't know what CBPR is, we're going to get all into that because today I'm joined by Ruth and Bill and Amy, special guest who's been on the show several times now. And Amy is our, I don't know, Amy, I know you have a really cool title about Associate Director of Content Marketing, but really I think of you as the CBPR guru. Is that fair? Is that a fair characterization?
I will go ahead and accept that. I think the more formal definition would be the author of the report, but sure.
Okay, fair enough. Author, guru, yes. So Amy helps us make sure this thing happens, and she's amazing at it. But also, so many of our clients are amazing because they participate in this thing, and not just clients, everyone in the industry. What makes this report so exciting for folks like Bill and Ruth and myself to read, and I'm sure Amy gets great joy putting it all together, is we have so many amazing participants because the 2023 report, I believe, marks the 14th annual running of this report by Payscale, and it's the largest known survey of its kind. This year we had like almost 5,000, 4,900 and some odd comp professionals jumping in there, HR leaders, business execs. We run this thing usually in Q4 of the year. So this represents the data you're going to hear about today, represents the time period from October 22 through December 22. So super excited. You can be with us today, Amy, to share all this. And of course, we'll ask Bill and Ruth for their thoughts as Amy shares her insights. But Amy, I just wanted to let's dive right in. What were some of your key takeaways? You're putting this together. What things were kind of like the light bulb started going off for you?
Every year when we do CBPR, we look for an overriding theme. And I think this year we have a lot to pick from because 2022 was just chock full of interesting things in the compensation world. But the theme we landed on was really the kind of ongoing, or like recently resurrected power struggle between what employees want and what employers are trying to do for their businesses. And this tug of war is, highlighted in things like pay transparency legislation, the fluctuating labor market, increased employee demands for compensation, benefits, inflation, just a lot of things that are concerning, I think, to HR leaders and comp pros are covered in this report. And it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, that's I want to dive right into this because, the economy is in a certain state right now. And so we sort of expect the labor market and the employment sort of recruiting and retention to be a certain way when the market's a certain way. And I'm really curious because it feels to me like everything's not kind of behaving as you'd expect. And so what were some of the labor challenges you started seeing surface as you started pulling this together?
Oh, I love how you described our economy as a certain state because that's perfect. What is that state? That is the question. Yeah, I think everyone that's been watching this evolve over the past year and in recent months would answer in the same way. We don't know what's going on with the economy right now. We are seeing a lot of news and speculation that we are possibly going to go into a recession, but I read articles about this every day that has it going back and forth from recession's going to be deep, it's going to be mild, we're not going to have one at all. And what we're seeing from our report, the data that we collected, asking compensation professionals and HR leaders to comment on how they're experiencing the economy in 2022 and what they think 2023 is going to be like. What we are seeing is that voluntary turnover rates have gone down. So we're coming out of the Great Resignation, where voluntary turnover rates were extremely high. They're 36% on average, and they've gone down to about 25%, which is still, higher than most organizations want in an ideal world, but reflective more of kind of what's normal for organizations. And that's definitely having an impact on retention and when it comes to being able to hang on to your current employee workforce. But it does vary by industry. So some industries are going to have higher turnover rates and others are going to have lower turnover rates. I want to say it's lowest for the education world and technology, which is where we're seeing layoffs happen. I think because some of that expectation of what's available in the world is starting to decline.
Yeah. And are there other industries where we feel like this is not, it's maybe a little weaker, or that the turnover is higher?
Yes, turnover is still, higher than average if you're in the, leisure and hospitality world. It's higher if you're in retail and customer service. It's higher if you're in healthcare, social assistance, and it's higher if you're in construction. So you're going to have your mileage may vary when it comes to the type of talent that you're trying to hold on to and what you have to do to hold on to that talent, because some jobs are still very hot.
Interesting. And Bill, as our chief compensation ombudsman here, someone who's been doing compensation possibly longer than anyone currently on this show or listening to it.
Thanks, Russ.
No problem. I got your back here, Bill. Any insights into maybe why is those sort of traditional industries that always have high turnover, or do you think maybe there's something else going on here?
I think the answer is both. And I, apologize for the sound of my voice, a little bit of a scratchy throat here. But I think Amy just listed a handful of industries that are having the most turnover. There are also industries that are having a lot of turmoil in pay, turmoil that's positive for the employees, pay going up in healthcare, in retail, a lot at the lower end of the spectrum, which is a little unusual. I also think there's a lot of adjustments happening akin to right sizing, if you will, that's been going on the last 2 years with employers across all industries having to struggle to react to increases and decreases in demands for their products and services. Some overhired, thinking that newfound demand during COVID was a new baseline when it wasn't. And while others were forced to cut staffs, because demand, the floor just dropped out, and then all of a sudden it came back, and so there you've got people firing, hiring, firing, going on. And now, back to what state is the economy in? I had the same question, Amy. We don't know what state it is, but everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen. And all the indicators point toward confusion, and that, history, that there's a saying, history repeats itself, but it doesn't really repeat itself. It echoes, and it's unclear what the echo is doing now, and even, recently we've seen today, the employment numbers or the new jobs numbers are out in the Department of Labor's February jobs report, and they're up higher than was expected. Unemployment's gone up a little, but new jobs have grown faster than was expected for February. And what does that mean? In old school economics, it means that we're headed toward a recession and we're not headed toward a recession. So you be the judge. Can I add one more thought about the difference between involuntary and voluntary turnover? And that it's important to remember they're not totally independent. So, we will talk about the, both issues, but, companies that lay people off will have typically lower voluntary turnover because the company has taken action to get rid of people, and some of those people would likely have left on their own anyway. That's how it works on a basic level, but a more complicated level, there's a secondary effect. If your organization executes involuntary, turnover with larger layoffs linked to poor communicated layoffs, just name a few ways you can do it, that can result in what I would call follow-on voluntary turnover, where people are getting frustrated and concerned about the employer, about the culture, about working there, about, the future. And so layoffs can trigger voluntary turnover. And so it's, they're not independent actions. So it's just important to remember that and pay attention to what's going on in your organization.
I think that's a good insight. Well, Amy, it kind of gets into maybe why some people are leaving. Do we ask folks on the report, on the best practices report, why they leave?
We do ask what is most to blame for voluntary turnover from the perspective of the participants. And we have a complex table in the report that has a lot of answer choices for that. And we ask participants to rank them first, second, and third. And the top ranked answer choice for first place is compensation. You can kind of look at 2022 as the year of compensation in a way. Just so much happened around wage increases, inflation, pay transparency legislation, that it has been just a hot topic in the last year. And I think that's going to continue into 2023. Also high on the list were things like limited advancement opportunities. So, are you promoting people within your organization? Do they feel like there is a reason to stay for those opportunities? And then the third and fourth choices were employee entitlement, or kind of grass is greener syndrome, which ties to that great resignation world that we've been living in for the past 2 years. And then also burnout due to being understaffed or overworked, which ties to quiet quitting, which is also a topic that we cover in the report.
Oh, interesting. Man, even now I'm still interested to see compensation is so high on the list. Of course, as comp folks, that doesn't necessarily surprise us, although with the economy in its current state, that's sort of, whatever that state that is sort of interesting. Ruth, does it feel right to you that compensation's number one?
I think so for 2022, as Amy says. Obviously we're always aware of any bias in our surveys, and as you mentioned, Russ, we do have a lot of comp pros. There are HRs and business leaders who also take part in this study. But the correlation is with some of the other key surveys that we saw in the fall of 22 that we've talked about on this podcast before. So there's a study on employee sentiment by Mercer, and another similar study on why people were leaving organizations done by McKinsey. And they both had compensation and career advancement as the top two reasons which correlate with this study. So I feel confident, in those answers. And again, not a surprise, compensation against the backdrop of a cost of living crisis. We know employees are laser focused on their compensation. They want increases to match inflation, and they're also concerned about pay progression. So that's where I think that some of the career advancement comes in. People want to know how they can increase their pay, and how they might do that by advancing their careers or getting a promotion.
Interesting. And well, you mentioned a couple of things in there. And one of them was sort of the inflation crisis. So whatever the state is, right? Definitely inflation is quite high. And I know every time we do a webinar with clients, we always seem to get asked the question, how do you see your clients responding to inflation and these sorts of changes? And what are we doing as comp pros and HR people to help our employees out in that space? Amy, what, as we move into this sort of area, what, given all that going on, what can employees expect in terms of pay increases? Is that something that we're seeing is going up, going down? What's the general mood?
That is a fascinating question, Russ, and I think top of mind for a lot of employers around this time of year, if not earlier in the year. Based on the economy, how much are you going to give? Are you going to give anything? So what we're seeing in 2023 is that 80% of organizations are planning to give pay increases of some kind. But we have another 15% saying they aren't sure, which means that up to 95% of organizations could be giving pay increases. And on average, we are seeing that those increases are likely to be over that 3% base pay increase that persisted for so long following the Great Recession. We're seeing 56% of organizations planning to give more than 3%, which is fewer than last year when 53% gave over 3%, but much higher than previous years when that number hovered around a third of organizations giving above 3%. So we expect pay increases to be above 3%. However, we don't expect them to be higher than 5%, which was more common last year than this year.
Interesting. Bill, what's your take on that? Given the state of the state here, did you expect raises to be about 3%? Do you think that's right?
I do think that's right. There's a push-pull situation with employers looking forward to a potential recession or recession-like economy. They're looking at their business results and also looking at over their shoulders at what their employees are finding vis-a-vis big increases by jumping to other employers. So there's a lot of information coming into the employers that's not all telling them the same thing. And I think a lot of companies are trying to make sure that their employee group is somewhat stabilized. And I think they will probably try to keep their raises. I mean, basically, I'm going to repeat what Amy said in different words, but they're going to try and keep their raises high as they can, not as high as they were last year in general. And perhaps as the year goes on and things change, if they change for the worse or the better, they will probably use their annual bonus plans or other variable plans to make up for the positive or negative difference. And it's important to remember that this is, on a industry specific or even a company specific basis, because you have to do what's right for your organization. But you also have to keep in mind what the people you're competing against are doing. Because if you say no salary increases and all your competitors say, 4.5%, you're going to start seeing people leave quickly, and it's going to be hard to stop it.
Yeah, especially with the number one reason being compensation there. Ruth, what's your, does that feel right to you also? Are you surprised by the 3%?
No, I would expect it to be, higher. I think, seeing that number of organizations that plan to give, 5% increases. I think companies are still playing catch up. Those that didn't make significant adjustments through 22 have got work to do going into 23. But I think the only point I'd make here is the day of like one magic number serving us all as we set compensation budgets, I think, has gone. And this is very sector specific and even, geo specific. So you do need to, kind of do your research to look at what's impacting your specific talent markets to understand what that number should be.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, I remember we were doing back before COVID, in the before times, we used to do those webinars like weaponizing compensation, right? And this was back when like Target and others or Amazon would come into a space, into a sector, and just say $15 an hour. I think even call centers at Bank of America going $20 an hour, and just really using it as a way to recruit in times where it's hard to find people. And I kind of wonder if we're starting to move back to a time when people are starting to really get very tactical about their compensation and thinking more in that manner, instead of just, is everybody doing 3? Okay, we'll do 3. We were all sort of working together during COVID. Now we're kind of coming out of that, and we're sort of back to competing against each other a little bit.
Yeah, and we've seen practice of employers, particularly those that have higher numbers of lower wage workers, who have focused increases on those workers, or they've done specific one-off payments to counteract the cost of living crisis. So it is definitely a mixed bag in terms of how people are approaching this.
And so, Amy, thinking about that, if we're trying to understand, if we, taking what Ruth and Bill both said there with the idea that, hey, companies, it's not as standard as it used to be, even by industry and geography. Maybe people are doing a little different things. It seems like it's more important than ever to really get good market data and really understand what folks are doing, so you can avoid the situation Bill just said. If you decide you don't want to do an increase this year, how bad is that going to be compared to your neighbors or competitors in your same market? What are we seeing for trends around how people are thinking about getting their market data?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Before I dig into that, I think it's important to note that really you have to focus on pay communications around this. So yes, you should absolutely be digging into distinct sources of data. And our report does show that most organizations use between 2 and 4 data sources when they are looking to inform market pricing for salaries. That's the expected. And at minimum, you should have 3 sources so that you can triangulate pricing and make sure that you are setting salaries at market rates that are fair. But really, it's important to make sure you are explaining why it is fair. to your employees. And I don't know if we're going to go into pay communications as in depth in this particular session as we might otherwise, but there's a whole section on that in the report. And I think it's important to not just have multiple sources of data, but to explain to your employees how you determine what both their pay is and what their pay increases are. Because you could be doing everything right, but to the employee, they may just see, a peer of mine said that they got X, and I didn't, so it's not fair. And I think that that's something that gets overlooked a lot by a lot of organizations, the importance of that communication. It's also, something to think about is that the use of more than 5 sources in a lot of organizations, if you have a lot of different industry roles, if you need niche data for particular types of jobs that you are setting pay for, it can be common to use more than 20 sources, and top performing organizations do that.
Interesting. And do you have any insights into the kind of sources, or do we see any movement in the kinds of data people trust more?
Yeah, there's a whole breakdown of that in the compensation best practices report. We have a complex table that shows all the different types of data that you can get. So if you're a comp pro, you're probably familiar with traditional surveys. The most popular data source is free or open line data. That's you're going to Google it. You're going to go look at what people are posting for free online. And 50% of organizations say that they do that. But what's important to note is that when it comes to salary data that you trust, that drops to the very bottom. And what is at the very top for trusted data, as in data that has been vetted against various indicators to make sure that it is accurate and usable, are salary survey data from traditional publishers, HR reported aggregated market data that you get from being a subscription member of compensation software like we have here at Payscale, and even resources like Peer that we have here at Payscale also, which in our survey is described as a closed network HR reported salary data source, because we're trying to make it generic to encapsulate where else you might find data like that. But we see an increase in the number of organizations that are using new and different types of data sources when it comes to setting pay.
It's great to see people are looking at the different options. But it's interesting to me too that there's such this big drop. Literally, just looking at the percentages here in the charts. You have 50% of people are looking at or using online data, free data in some way, but then literally only 5% use it as first tier. Only less than 10% use it as second tier. That's just quite a juxtaposition there. Bill, what's your reaction to that? Does that surprise you at all? That kind of dichotomy?
It actually does not surprise me. It makes sense when you're looking for information in general on any topic, it doesn't have to be compensation or HR related. You automatically think, where can I get the best answer? Where can I get what I think is going to most quickly get me information I need and can rely on? And, we've all been trained to go to big name sources. You go to Webster's Dictionary, you go to the New York Times, you go to the Wall Street Journal, you go to, you have this list in your head. And the traditional survey publishers have been doing this function, providing this function and providing these reports for, 50, 75 years. And everyone has relied on them at some level for that whole period of time. It's safe. It's like the old adage, nobody got fired for hiring IBM. You can't, you can't go wrong with that. And so for companies that use those sources, that would, often be their first choice. But what's interesting to me is that although, as Amy pointed out, that the free and open online data source drops to the bottom of the trust level, it still shows up in the top 3 of it's included in in the top 3 tiers of data sources for more people than anything else. Which tells me, yes, it's a dichotomy, but it's also, I know I can always get an answer. And, one thing I always say is like finding any answer is a good starting point. Having no answer is, you're stuck having to make something up. So if you have an answer, you can at least look at that and try and figure out how to adjust it or like how to use it, regardless of how much faith you put in the individual publisher of that data. So I think people are being smart and judicious about how they're picking their sources and when and how they're using them.
Yeah, I think that's right. Ruth, what's your reaction to some of this data here around data source usage?
Well, it's interesting because we have done a European cut of this report for the first time this year, Amy, haven't we? And I've just been looking at some of that data because we're doing an event next week on that. And in Europe, the free or open online data is not as popular. So the traditional salary surveys are more popular here in Europe. So I don't think we have that same kind of like access maybe to as many free or open sources of data. But I thought that was an interesting observation when looking at the European cut of data.
Oh, that is really interesting. Yeah, I had to think about this more, but I kind of like where you're going, Bill. I wonder if I'm really curious about the Europe thing too. I wonder if that has to do with some of the privacy rules there. But what's really interesting to me is if the free data is one of your cuts and you're using it as your third cut, you kind of know, especially when you're dealing with interview candidates, their only source is probably that open free stuff. So being able to compare that to what you're using for your structures, let's say if you're using one of the top tier items, at least you kind of know what the employee's thinking, which is sort of interesting. So another hot topic, obviously, let's get away from data for a minute and get back to the thing that's sort of on everybody's mind after you get past the state of the economy is pay transparency. Amy, do we see, it seems like it's hot. All these states are passing laws about putting job ranges on job descriptions or job postings. What do we see in our report regarding pay transparency?
It's definitely hot in the news, and I think that pay transparency is going to gain traction over time to the extent that I think employees are going to expect it. Or I should say your job applicants are going to expect it, and you're going to get more applications and higher quality ones if you are posting the pay range in jobs, because other competitors are going to be doing that, and those jobs are going to be more attractive if the employee can see for sure that the whole interview process is worth their time. And we are seeing that organizations are adopting this at faster rates. So a minority of organizations, 45%, tell us that they include pay ranges in job postings at present, but that is up from double last year when only 22% of organizations added pay ranges to job postings. And there is a split in the report that shows why they do it, like whether they're doing it because it's required by law, which is 27%, or they do it regardless of whether it's required by law. I'm sorry, that one's 27%. The ones that do it because it's required is 18%. But that total 45% number of those things added together is twice what it was last year, which I think is the most interesting point. Pay transparency is likely to spread in terms of legislation in 2023. The reason for this legislation is, it's multi-pronged, but one of the things that we know that pay transparency does is it closes the gender pay gap. And that's high on my list of priorities right now because we are publishing our gender pay gap report next week. And it's exciting to see that the gender pay gap is starting to close in certain sectors. And so I don't know if this pay transparency legislation is quite having a direct impact on that yet. But if it's not now, I think it will over time. And that is really exciting from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging perspective. If that's not something that's important to your organization, it probably should be. And, there's a whole section on pay equity and compensation best practices report and why pay equity is something that you should be investing in order to become more transparent, is really kind of a requirement because you don't want candidates to have that experience of looking at free online salary data and then comparing that with what you are offering and having a negative reaction. So you really have to have all of your ducks in a row when it comes to how you are pricing jobs and how you are communicating the pricing of those jobs to applicants.
Yeah, I think that's well, it's exciting to hear some of that good news. I know we still got to keep watching things, but that's great. And I like your insight and your comment there about, pay transparency and pay equity are linked, right? You can't really have pay transparency without having pay equity, and you can't really show you're equitable if you're also not transparent. So these things are really joined. And so we do a lot of work with clients on making sure, they understand that those challenges and maybe have the right tools to do that. And I know, Ruth, you've been doing a lot of work with our clients on those pay transparency solutions. How do these trends that we're seeing in the report sort of align to some of the things you're seeing as you work with clients?
Well, interestingly, we've seen a significant uptick in terms of organizations that are looking to improve their compensation practices. So if you think about it, pay ranges kind of historically have very much been used for internal administration. But now they're having to be externally facing. Now we're having to put them on job ads. Now we're having to talk to employees about them. I think most of us are discovering that there's some work to do in terms of improving those practices. And so we did see in the study 48% of organizations are saying pay transparency legislation is forcing them to drive change and improve their comp practices. And interestingly, when we also saw that organizations, when asked about the main reason that was stopping them from progressing their pay transparency, not having structures in place was the main reason. So that's where we're seeing a lot of activity in terms of clients coming to us and saying, please help us with our compensation structures. Amy, you mentioned communication earlier. I still find it, well, we did see the uptick in terms of companies that were training managers on pay communications. That's 49% this year, up from 36% last year, Amy, I think.
That's right.
So, I think people are starting to embrace the fact that managers, are your agents for change here in this transparency journey. And they need to be able to understand things like your pay philosophy, what are the things that you're trying to pay for in the organization, and pay structures, because employees increasingly are feeling empowered to ask those questions. And I think we all have to understand that, to tackle pay transparency, this doesn't just stop at the door of the comp department. We all have to, across an organization, work together to get to that point of being able to share comp information across the organization.
I think that's right. It doesn't surprise me either about the salary structures. I know that's a lot of people are very passionate about those, including our product team here. But Bill, I wanted to ask you, you've been doing this a long time. You've been seeing these companies on a quest for pay equity and pay transparency for a long time. Do you get that sense, as Amy shared, that maybe we're starting to turn the corner here? And how do some of these things? What's your reaction to some of these trends?
Well, thanks for asking me that question. And Amy, prepare to have your mind blown, because when you were talking and Ruth added on, I was like, wait, this all comes together in a bizarre way. So I've been hearing about, pay transparency, DEI, diversity, gender pay gap for, my entire career. And if you look at old WorkSpan magazines from World at Work, back in the 80s, they were talking about these issues. But Amy used two phrases, one as she started talking about this topic, and one way at the beginning of the podcast, where she said, it's hot in the news, talking about pay transparency, high year salary increases, DEI, gender pay gap. And then there's this power struggle between employers and employees. And like what's happened, I think, is that it's not HR talking to HR about what HR should do. It's the entire world talking about what's the right thing to do. And so the fact that this is all in the news is now giving our HR peers enough influence with employers and, employer groups, et cetera, to be able to actually have influence and say, no, we do have to do this. It's not, just HR being whiny and trying to get something done. There's a lot of pressure coming from, outside the HR group saying, yes, we do need to fix these problems. We do need to do this. And I think that that's a huge part of it. And so it's got enough weight behind it now that companies have to communicate better. They have to fix these, gender pay problems, these pay equity problems, these diversity problems, inclusion problems, et cetera. And yeah, it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to be fast, but I think, we're definitely seeing a huge increase in the rate at which things are changing and being adopted. And we'll continue seeing that.
I mean, I think it's really exciting, and it's not just like newspapers, it's all of social media. So any point in time you can go into, LinkedIn, Twitter, a Reddit forum or some other forum and find people talking about their salaries. They'll find them talking about pay equity and why, they believe it is or is not something that their organization cares about. And you find a lot of misinformation as well, from employees not understanding how their pay is determined. I think one of the most common ones is, people starting to see pay ranges posted to job ads and saying, hey, I don't make the top of this range. That's unfair. Right. So like one big communication point that I think every organization should be investing in is explaining how people fall along ranges to their employees. Like, what is the methodology for that practice? Because there is just a lot of misunderstanding. The average person is going to see a pay range and they're going to want the biggest number on that pay range. It's like a natural human instinct. But there is, a mathematical methodology for how pay ranges are determined and how people are slotted along those ranges. But if you don't explain that to your job candidates and current employees, they're going to be dissatisfied looking at those numbers and making their own assumptions. So I think there's a lot of work to do from a communication standpoint, but the conversation is really exciting because we are moving towards pay equity, and I think that's where we want to be.
I'll double down on that. Like the number of times I've heard people, low level and high level people say things like, the median salary for this job that you're telling us is wrong. Half the people in our organization in that job are paid less than that.
Right.
And I'd be like, no.
That's exactly how that works.
And it comes back to what both Ruth and Amy, and I've said in the past, Ruth and Amy said it today, is it's you got to train like you're basically everybody, but start with your managers to understand how to communicate this stuff and how to make sure people understand what it means, and understand what it doesn't mean, because that's your best defense against the social media rants, which if you as an employer don't take control of the conversation around your employees, they're going to seek that information at the best available source. And if it's not my manager, it's going to be Reddit or TikTok or whatever. And then, they get all worked up over bad information. So give them good information that you can stand behind. And that will help not everybody, let's be realistic, but most people will understand there is a process, there is rationality, and this is acceptable.
Yeah, great insights, Bill. Ruth, anything you want to leave us with here before we wrap up?
Well, other than, please do go and download the report. It's on the front page still, I think, of our website. So if you want to dig into that data, we find people like to use it for building business cases, potentially, for work that they want to get done in terms of their comp strategy and comp structures. It's really just a mine of information. So I just congratulate you, Amy, on another amazing report this year.
Thank you so much, Ruth. As you mentioned, it is on the website. There's a banner at the top of the homepage on payscale.com that will take you directly to the report, or you can click through the Research and Insights tab, and it is pinned to the top of that section as well.
Awesome. Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedule, especially right now, and you get ready to, it's been launched and you're following up with the activities. So thank you for another amazing report this year. And Bill, thank you for joining us despite your gravelly voice. But
can I add one quick point?
Please.
Reiterate what Ruth and Amy were saying is, download it and save it on your desktop. And just think, every time somebody comes into your office and asks you a question about what other companies do, what's normal, this is, hundreds of statistics that will answer at least the first level answer that question, and just having it at your ready, flip through it so you know what's in it, so that you can, leverage it, make yourself look better to the people you work with.
For sure.
That's right. Maybe also talk to them when you have a gravelly voice too, because you sound wiser and maybe more experienced. So just throwing that out there.
Why, thank you.
So thanks again, Amy. Thanks, Bill. And thank you, Ruth, for joining us. When you do download the report and take a look at it and read through it, you've heard what we think, but please let us know what you think. What were your reactions? You can do that by either emailing us at coffee@payscale.com or by reaching out to us at Payscale on Twitter. Thanks for listening to Comp and Coffee. Comp and Coffee is a Payscale production dedicated to the compensation community. We welcome your feedback. Send email to coffee@payscale.com, tweet us at Payscale, or share your thoughts in our Payscale Connect community. Until next time, keep your coffee hot and your data fresh.